Here I present the mental stages of Guy Montag. Who the hell names their kid Guy? This begins with what I like to call Unga Bunga, fire good. In all seriousness, he has the mental capacity of a rock with how simple his thought process is. He purely exchanges actions for stimuli without actually thinking about the action or the consequences of it. Thing make me feel good, me do thing. Pretty much a caveman mindset. Or, I guess, a caveman armed with a flamethrower. Next up, he talks to a random girl on the street named Clarice, and she makes him use more than one total brain cell. Here we find out that Montag has had this same caveman mindset for over 10 years, and that not once in his life has he even thought about reading a book. She also rocks his entire world with three extremely simple words. Are you happy? This one question gets him pretty aggravated, and he spends the rest of the day thinking about it. Afterwards, Montag comes home to his wife, Mildred, asleep with an empty bottle of sleeping pills next to her. He understandably calls 911 thinking she's going to die. This knocks a little more sense into him, but what happens next really makes him start to think. Two technicians come in, not doctors, suck all the crap out of her stomach and all of her blood out, and then pump new blood back in. Upon talking to these technicians, they almost get a dozen of these calls a night, and they don't even need a real doctor to handle it. This event really knocks him out of his simple mindset, kind of makes him start to question if society is really okay. The next morning, he sees Clarice's house and watches them experience actual emotion, not just these like forced pseudo feelings he's seen his whole life. At this point, I think Montag is actually starting to realize what their society deems normal is not really normal, and he even says, I don't know anything anymore. After seeing a real family experience real emotions, he comes home to Mildred talking to her family, of which is actually three massive screens on the walls, and she's talking to them like they're real people. He begins to somewhat contrast this weird interaction with a bunch of TVs and Clarice's interaction with her actual family and how much different they really are. He once again talks to Clarice, who is quite literally beating the stupid out of him with facts and logic, or in more accurate terms, basic human thought. She then does this little trick with a dandelion, afterwards saying that Montag isn't in love. He's very upset by this statement, although I believe that it does help improve his upper-level brain function, get him a bit above rock level. After his talk with Clarice, he goes into work, where the mechanical hound thinks he's sus. I'm sorry. About a week later, he talks to Clarice again, where they have a bit of a deeper conversation. She says that Montag looks more relaxed, and he responds with the question, why aren't you in school? This prompts her to say that she doesn't fit in because she's afraid of her classmates. 6 of them were shot in the last year, and 10 of them were killed in car crashes. Overall, this conversation helped Montag if it gave him a very accurate and blunt view on their society, and how completely and utterly destroyed it is. About another week later, Clarice is nowhere to be found, and while he's on his way to work, Montag notices that the lot where her house used to be is abandoned. When at work, he is called out to a home that has been hiding books. Upon arriving, they douse everything in kerosene, and Montag tries to save the woman who owns said house. Alternatively, she responds by pulling out a match and ignites both the kerosene and herself, leaving a statement upon her death, I want to stay here. Despite Montag's best efforts, she refuses to go with, as she would rather die with her books. This event really rocks Montag to his core. When he gets home, he kind of just sits on the floor, making small, unintelligible, incoherent noises and crying. Pretty much just me on any night of the week. The next day, Montag begins asking questions about his marriage with Mildred. As it turns out, neither of them can remember where they even met. He realizes he doesn't actually really know her, and she knows her walls 1,000 times more than she knows him. He even asks himself, how did you get so empty? After this long thought press, he finally gets extremely angry and starts blasting music in the house. Montag then talks to Mildred and asks her about the Clarice, only for Mildred to say that she got ran over by a car, died, and her whole family moved away. Immediately after this, he gets paranoid, thinking that the hound is outside of his window. Whether or not this is true, I'll leave up to you. I honestly think it's just paranoia, though. The next morning, Montag acts sick and asks Mildred to call Beatty, the lead fireman, to tell him he's sick. Mildred refuses, and they have a meaningless conversation, and then they get to the meat of it. After vomiting, Montag tells her about the woman who lit herself on fire. Montag says he might quit his job, which causes Mildred to get very upset. Mildred calls the woman simple-minded. If only she knew. Montag finally puts everything into perspective, saying that we need to really be bothered once in a while, outlining the fantasy land that the US seems to be living in. A few moments later, Beatty shows up at their door, and a plot-changing conversation ensues. It's very obvious that Beatty knows Montag took a book, but rather than just taking him in and having him arrested, Beatty tries to snap him out of it. Beatty explains that over time, people's attention span has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter, and they stopped accepting controversial topics, or even really topics that anybody might dislike. In his own words, the cigarette people are weeping, burn the book. Now I'm saying we must cater to Marlboro, and even better, Big Oil. The minds of basically everybody has been reduced to the caveman mindset that we saw with Montag in the beginning. As Beatty says, if you don't want a man politically unhappy, don't give him two sides to a question to worry him. Give him one. Better yet, give him none. Here's my translation. Brain think overrated. Me see, me likey. While this whole conversation is happening, Mildred is just cleaning everything in the room, and at one point she tries to grab the pillow that Montag is on, not knowing that the book he stole is directly under it. This one factor makes one of the most stressful scenes in the book. After Beatty leaves, Montag says that he's angry, but that he wants to hold on to his anger rather than letting it out by driving like a maniac like Mildred says he should do. He then reveals to Mildred that he has dozens of books, and that he wants her to read them with him. This is the moment of enlightenment for Montag, which actually frees him from the shackles of their remarkably brain-dead society. Montag spends the next 2 days trying to understand the books, to know the meaning of them, all the while Mildred is, clowning on him. She hits him with this line. Books aren't people. You read and I look around, but there isn't anybody. Immediately after she says, my family is people. They tell me things, I laugh, they laugh, and the colors! Her mental capacity is also somehow worse than mine. After all this talk, Montag comments on the constant bombers flying overhead, and that the world is starving while they seem to live carefree. This all unfortunately goes directly over Mildred's head. Shortly after, Montag goes out in search of an old professor and finds Dr. Faber. Faber talks to him about the books and the meaning of them. He then hands Montag his address in case he's angry with him, showing that it's pretty obvious he's a fireman. Montag later calls Faber and asks about famous books, wondering if there are any left, to which he replies, none, and immediately hangs up. At home, there is a more tense conversation between Montag and Millie about the books, and he promptly leaves. On a subway, he tries his best to memorize the Bible, to no avail, and he pretty much ends up driving himself crazy for a little bit. He arrives at Faber's house, where he is shown the purpose that books serve and the reason they are so important. He shows Montag that they possess what nothing else does in this day and age, quality. The books have density and meaning, not just empty emotion like everything else. They then come up with a plan to help make things better. Montag says he will plant books at firemen's homes and call in alarms to have them burnt. This interaction ends with Faber giving Montag an earpiece that will allow him to talk to Montag while away. His talk with Faber pushes Montag from merely seeing that things are bad to trying to actually correct them. Montag comes home to a dinner party, which has got to be the most brain-numbing thing I have ever read. All of the people just speak at each other, not with each other, in the simplest phrases physically possible. Montag is so tilted by this that he pulls out a book and starts reading poetry at them. This was a terrible idea, and it ends with one of the women crying. We also learn that childcare is basically a myth to these people. They send them to school 90% of the time, and the other 10%, they treat them like laundry, in their own words. They just toss them in a room with a bunch of the screens, another one of the families. Peak parenting. After this, Montag goes into work. When walking in, he notices the hound is missing. He walks in, extremely nervous, and sits down to play poker with the other firemen. Shortly after, Beatty uses phrases from assorted text to stress Montag out further. He uses Ben Shapiro tactics to completely destroy him with facts and logic. In all seriousness, Beatty shows that he is very well educated and turns every text he can think of against Montag. Beatty then grabs his hand and feels Montag's extremely fast heart rate. He just keeps pressing him. After pushing Montag to the brink of breaking, they leave for an alert after Montag tries to leave. This alert ends up being his own house. Beatty forces Montag to torch his own home, realizing that Mildred, his own wife, reported him. He can't get out as the Hound is waiting nearby. Montag tries to avoid burning some of the books, but takes the whole house down. After completely destroying it, Beatty hits him, knocking the earpiece that Faber was speaking in out of his ear. After realizing that at this point it's us or them, Montag points the flamethrower at Beatty and turns him into a human slushie. The Hound lunges at him, only to get the same treatment. He runs off with the few books that are left, gets hit by a car, and has a mental breakdown after realizing that he not only committed murder, but also ousted himself from ever having a normal life. After acting like me when my PC decided to commit die, he gets up and rushes to Faber's house. On his seashell, he hears that both the cops are already after him, and that another war has been declared. Then a car rounds the corner, flying at him at 130 miles an hour, or my typical speed in elementary school zone. Oh god, why are the speed bumps screaming? Montag thinks it's the cops, loses it and trips, only for them to shank the wheel and crash. It was just another group of homicidal teens looking for their next thrill, because apparently crack isn't good enough for them anymore. He plants a book at a fireman's house and arrives at Faber's. As it turns out, they brought another hound that is tracking Montag down, and they end up having to sterilize everything in the house with alcohol and use Faber's old clothes to get the scent off of Montag. After he loses the hound, somehow, they send it on some random guy and claim that it's him for the press. Montag escapes using the river and floats there thinking about the roller coaster that is his life. After exiting said river, he sees a fire, but not the fire he's used to. This fire is warm and comforting, rather than destructive and turning people into mashed potatoes. He watches the people at the fire, and they invite him to join them. As it turns out, they are all educated people who have an IQ higher than the Kardashians. They are the ones who will carry on the knowledge when the brain damaged society falls apart. As it turns out, they don't actually have books, instead they memorize them so that they don't get caught. The next morning, the bombs go off. The city is leveled in an instant, and Montag realizes that Mildred didn't really actually mean all that much to him. I guess it's hard to relate to a sentient toaster. After the dust settles, they head for the city, hoping to rebuild and fix the mistakes of those before them.